Hello. Today I wanted to talk about Elixir configuration files and how to organize them. This is inspired by an article I came across by Malta Rhoda from BitCrowd talking about how to configure Phoenix apps and two small adjustments with big effects. The article talks about the default file structure of the Phoenix application and the configuration files, and how the configuration files are broken up into environment based files and then a runtime based file. The problems it points out, which I've encountered myself, is that it becomes confusing to know what's used at compile time, what's used at runtime, and what's happening with a specific configuration variable across these environments when they're spread out across all these different files. The solution they propose, which I found very helpful, is to reorganize these files by concern and separate them into config or compile time files and runtime files, and then to make it a rule that anything that can be configured at runtime stays in the runtime directory and is not available anywhere else. And then within your feature specific compile time files, you can branch by environment type so that within a specific domain you can see exactly what's happening with your endpoint, for example, and see how it changes between dev, test, and prod without having to jump around between a bunch of different files. So I wanted to show what that might look like and the process that I've gone through for doing that myself, and some of the things I've found useful when doing that. So I've made this example project here, just called Elixir configs example, and I've got a basic Phoenix new file structure. We can look in the configs directory. We've got our config exs as our starting point. Then we have our import with where it's changes based on dev, test, or prod. And then over here we have our runtime exs file, where we do a lot of looking up of environment variables and change settings based on those. So I've made a sample pull request to go over all the commits I made to follow the pattern that BitCrowd is suggesting here, and show what that process looks like and some modifications I've made that I've found useful. So one of the things they point out is that you need some way to set defaults for your runtime variables. So down here in their example, they show that they make this custom module right in line in the runtime exs, because you can't import runtime configuration variables like you can compile time ones. There's no way to get dev, test, prod specific variables for runtime and import them and put them in separate files. And so that leaves this gap where we need a way to set defaults for specific environments. And so the way they're approaching it is they set this default function and they pattern match on the environment variable name and the environment, and then they say use a guard clause to say when, if dev test, then use this default. I take a slightly different approach here because, well, I'll show you. So here's my first commit where I'm adding this shared runtime config module. And what I'm wanting to do is make this shareable, not just for a single project, but have some of the scaffolding be usable across applications in case you're on a team where you're running multiple Elixir applications and you might have some shared internal library or open source library where you don't want to reinvent this every single time. So I've tried to make this shareable version of this that can be used. So in the docs here, you can see how you would set this up in your runtime EXS file. You would make your own custom module where you would call use on this new module, creating shared runtime config. You could name this whatever you want. And then rather than having multiple functions, we just have a single defaults function that is a callback of this behavior that you have to implement, and it returns a map with string keys being environment variable names and values being a keyword list with environment mapping to whatever default is you want to give it. And then we also add a way to cast these values into different types in an easier way, so you don't have to reinvent that every time as well. So the default would just be to return a string, but let's say one of your configs is expecting an integer value. Well, you can say cast integer or cast boolean, or you could add more types as you needed. And then another important part of this is that when you call the get function on it, so if you want to look up an environment variable, you'll call get foo, and then if that default isn't defined for the environment you're in, you're going to get a loud error. And this is important for your observability, to let you know that there's something about your environment that's not what you expect. So this is mostly applicable for prod. If you're expecting some variable to exist in prod and you try to deploy and you get this big error, that's going to help you troubleshoot and know that your environment's not set up correctly. So we can look at some of the code for this module, what it looks like. We have some type declarations here for what this callback looks like. And then we're using the using macro to add some code to your module. So the code is going to inject the behavior and then define the get function, which calls out to our higher level module here, passing in the environment variable, trying to look up the defaults, the result of the defaults function, which needs to be implemented by the calling module, and then options like your casts. So that get function down here, it's going to look up the environment variable. It's going to then, if it's not defined, it's going to try and look for any defaults and pass in the current environment. So that is then going to look for the default, look for the environment variable in the list of defaults, raise if it's not there. Otherwise, it's going to start checking through the keyword lists and the map you defined to find that default. So that's the very first commit we need. I added this into the project at lib shared runtime config. You could have this somewhere else. That's just where I put it for the sake of this example. So now going back to our commits, we can see how we're using this in the runtime EXS module. So we go look at the diff here and we'll expand this. We put this right up at the top. We define our own runtime config module for this configuration file, and then we use the shared one, and then we implement the defaults, which is just an empty map because we haven't defined anything yet, which is what the following commits will do. So after this, it's a little bit of going through a pattern and following it over and over again, which is to go through the config file, find the one at a time, line by line, and then pull out the defaults and then put them into the defaults function callback, and then replace it with a runtime config.get call. So let's look at what that is like. So first one we have is the Phoenix server environment variable. So we say, so we grab that out and we say, what should the default be? And for test, it's going to be false. For dev, it's going to be false. We can know that by going to the test and dev.exs files and seeing how they're used there, or if they're not defined, we can assume that it's false. And then here we replace that with a runtime config.get function. This is actually a typo. We can, in a couple commits later, I fixed that, but it should be runtime config.get. And then because our rule is that we don't use it in any other place but runtime, so if it's a runtime variable, we only use it in the runtime file, then we actually go out to our test.exs and remove it. So server.false was part of the endpoint configuration, which was being used by that environment variable, Phoenix server. And so we don't want something that we are going to use at runtime also being set as a default in the test EXS, because that is more places to look and more complexity. So we're going to remove it out of there so there's only one place to look for it. A next big thing that we change in this runtime EXS file is that we take out this big wrapping conditional block where it wraps everything in a if config env equals prod. We don't need to do that with all of this anymore because we now have defaults. So we want to clean up this conditional and rely more on the defaults so that we're not, so we're having more of a consistent flow where almost all the time anything that is a runtime variable is going through a runtime config.get check and using that path rather than having to do that in the runtime file. So with that out of the way, we continue on making defaults. So we next find our database URL in test and dev. That could be nil because the different pieces of the database URL are split out: password, host, port, username, etc. They're all split out into separate ones, and only in prod is this actually expected as a full URL. So in dev and test, we just make this nil. And then in our next commit here, we see how we implement that, and we clean this up quite a bit because here it was having to do this logic where it raises if that variable is not there. But because we've built that functionality into our shared runtime config module, we don't have to re-implement this everywhere. We can just rely on this check that it will do the right thing, which helps a lot. So after we have done that, we just keep going through. We do this for ecto. We go through and alphabetize those defaults. That makes it easier to read and follow in the future. And then keep going through for pool size, secret key base, Phoenix host, port, DNS cluster query. We then get to a tricky one that is a little harder to do this with, and we can show you why. So while we want to do our best to keep all the runtime configs exclusively being used in the runtime EXS file, that's not always possible because of deep nesting. So here we can see that the port value, if we expand this, the port value is a dynamic runtime variable. However, this is also deeply nested under a couple keyword lists. And so that makes it harder to use across all the environments the same way because we don't want to override all the different parts of this configuration in every environment. We don't want test environment to set up port SSL and HTTPS, for example. We only want this port to change, and so for that one, we make an exception and we do wrap it in that config env equals prod check, but we minimize it to just this exception rather than having the whole file, and we still get quite a lot of benefit without having to wrap the whole file almost in that conditional. So we fixed that typo we talked about earlier. Delete some unnecessary comments now. And the next big part of this migration or reorganization is separating out our compile time configs. So we can look at the first one of those here. We're going to name it config compile database exs. In the article, they did this subdirectory called config. I found it to be clear to just name it compiled, and it's right out in your face that this is for compile time configurations, and it's easier for readers of the code to understand what the difference is. So we just pull the first database configs out of the config.exs file and make them into this database exs file. And then the next step we do is clean up. So we go back to our config.exs. This is where that starter config came from. We delete it since it's no longer needed, and then we can import that configuration. So we've got compile database.exs, and that brings it in to be used in our compile time configs. Let's look at one more example of going through that process. The next thing in the list is the endpoint config. So we start out this endpoint config by pulling this all out, all of this compile time configuration. And then after that's pulled out, we go back to our config exs, delete the now duplicated one, and then import that endpoint config. So the rest of these commits, they're just going through the rest of that file, making new compile time config files, assets, mailer, logger, Phoenix. And then once that config exs has been exhausted, we'll go look at this last one and see where it's at. You can expand that, and you can see that this file is now almost completely bare except for the importing of those other configs. This cleans this up pretty nicely. It's gives it a single responsibility, which is just to pull in the feature specific configs. So now we start moving through the environment specific ones and doing the same thing. So we go and look at dev.exs and we pull out the first ecto config and drop it into our new database config file with a conditional that says if this is dev, then we do this. So this starts to build out this file and separate what's happening in dev versus test versus prod all in one place, all in the scope of ecto and database, which makes it a lot easier to reason about and know what is changing and what isn't, and what's compile time versus runtime. We do the same thing with endpoint. We build up the endpoint file more. This one's more involved. We've got a few different things here, some comments for future optimizations, and then we take those out of the dev exs file. So you can see how that pattern repeats. You just go through each of those commits and pull things out of dev, you pull things out of test, pull things out of prod, and then when it's all done, you go and look, and we know those files are now empty, and so we can delete the importing of environment-specific files, so we're left with just the feature or domain-specific files. And then because those files are no longer being referenced, we can delete all three of them. And then just fixing one small bug here with the shared runtime config. I forgot that one of the valid defaults is nil, so we switched it to checking if they have a key versus just pulling the key out. See how if the default is nil, that's actually something we want to allow. So we're just more checking that if the key is there, and if it's not, then we raise. So fix that bug, and then we can switch over to the code here and look at the finished repo, and we see a lot more organized config directory. You can see we've got config, we've got runtime, we've got compile, and we can see exactly what's going on if I want to know what's happening with my logger, what's happening across the environments. It's very easy to look and see that all in one place. If there's anything runtime specific that has to do with my environment variables, I know where to look, and I can see that all in one place too. This one's a little bigger and is multifaceted, but at least it's scoped down to just runtime, and we can organize it that way. So I hope this has been helpful. I will link this GitHub repo in the description in case you want to look at it and go deeper into some of the changes in the process. I've found using this organization approach in my projects a lot faster and a lot more efficient, and really like it, and I'm thankful for the BitCrowd article, which helped send me down this path, which I will also link in the description. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.